Hi, everybody. I'm Mike from Zilla Blitz, and welcome. Over the course of the 2022 The Shores of Tripoli online Tournament of Champions, we created a number of segments focusing on the history of the First Barbary War and how that history is reflected in gameplay and card strategy. Now, a number of people asked for those segments to be compiled in one video, and so here they are. All 5 segments from the review videos from the Shores of Tripoli online Tournament of Champions in one easy-to-access place. Enjoy.
The First Barbary War centered on the United States and Tripoli, one of the 4 Barbary states. For hundreds of years, the Barbary states had declared that any nation without a peace treaty with them was in fact at war. These peace treaties often included significant monetary payment to the Barbary state, and also payment in maritime stores that would keep Barbary vessels in fighting form. If no treaty was in place, Barbary corsairs could attack and capture European or American ships at will. Captured ships were sold, and their crews were taken into captivity. This system of terror is often called piracy, but it really isn't. It was state-sponsored extortion and commerce raiding. Most European nations opted to sign peace treaties with the Barbary states, but the cost of these treaties could be exorbitant. When the United States had to negotiate treaties with each Barbary state after declaring independence, things went bad pretty quickly.
As Abby noted, the Tripolitan economy ran on the twin pillars of state-sponsored extortion and commerce raiding, or as we call them in the game, tribute and piracy. Because it was such an integral part of their economy, the designer did not create a specific card for the Tripolitans to raid, but instead, the Tripolitan player discards any card from their hand to conduct a pirate raid. However, the Tripolitan player does have battle cards that come into play when raiding. Happy Hunting allows the Tripolitan to roll 3 additional dice when raiding. Merchant Ships Converted allows the Tripolitan player to gain an additional Corsair after a successful raid. Lastly, US Signal Books Overboard can cause the American player a real headache as they must discard a card at random from their hand. Tripoli's allies, Algiers, Morocco, and Tunis, all can declare war and engage in their own raiding, although the Tripolitan player must play specific cards to do so. One of Tripoli's big gun cards is Yusuf Karamanli, which allows the Tripolitan player to raid from Tripoli and all of its active allies at once. The American player has a few tools to deal with Tripoli's allies. While patrolling or attacking directly are options, there are 2 cards that will take a Tripolitan ally right out of the game: a Show of Force, which historically happened with Morocco, and Tribute Paid, as the Americans did particularly with Algiers. Of course, a Show of Force requires 3 frigates, and Tribute Paid, while only requiring 1 frigate, also costs 2 precious gold pieces. Join us again next week as we look at more cards from the Shores of Tripoli.
When Tripoli declared war on the United States on May 14, 1801, the United States was not ready. A squadron of only 4 ships was on its way to the Mediterranean, and that squadron had little authority to make war. So the strategy that the Navy pursued was a blockade, where the United States would prevent any ships from coming and going from the port of Tripoli. The goal of the blockade was to prevent Tripolitan cruisers from coming out of Tripoli, but it was also to block supplies that Tripoli desperately needed from getting in. The Navy officially kept the blockade up for the whole war, but it wasn't really until several years into the war that they had enough ships to keep it up for real. American naval vessels spent much more time elsewhere in the Mediterranean than they did blockading Tripoli, either because of the distance they had to go to get supplies, or because tensions were high in the other Barbary states as well. Eventually, the Navy had to supplement the blockade with more aggressive bombardment of the port in order to make any headway against Tripoli.
As Abby noted, the American Navy was woefully unprepared to prosecute a war against the Tripolitans and settled on an early strategy of blockading Tripoli. The 4 naval movement cards in the American deck are the workhorses of this strategy, moving frigates to where they can best be deployed. The Lieutenant Sterrett in Pursuit card commemorates the first engagement between American and Tripolitan forces, when the USS Enterprise defeated a 14-gun Tripolitan Corsair just west of Malta. In the game, This card allows the American player to roll 3 dice for each frigate instead of 2 when making an interception roll. Now, the American naval forces naturally increase over time, with a new frigate coming into the game on 1802, 1803, and 1804. However, the American player also has the Congress Authorizes Action card in their deck, which brings on 2 additional American frigates in the following year. The American player can also play early deployment to bring a frigate into the war a year early. Finally, the American player can discard a card to build a gunboat to add to their fleet. The American player is also faced with a dilemma early in the game. They can play Swedish Frigates Arrive, which brings on 2 Swedish frigates to patrol outside of Tripoli. But this aid comes at a cost. Starting in 1803, the Tripolitan player may play Sweden Pays Tribute to send the Swedish frigates home and collect 2 precious gold coins. Join us next week as we'll continue with more tips from the shores of Tripoli.
On October 31st, 1803, the entire character of the First Barbary War changed. Up to this point, the U.S. Navy had been running a mostly ineffective blockade of Tripoli. Many of the vessels in the area were drawn away by conflicts with the other Barbary states. But on October 31st, the USS Philadelphia pursued a blockade runner heading into Tripoli harbor. Suddenly, the frigate hit a sandbar and ran completely aground. After a brief battle and an attempt to get the ship off the bar, the captain, William Bainbridge, surrendered the ship to the Tripolitans. He and more than 300 crew were taken into captivity. Adding insult to injury, the Tripolitans were able to refloat the Philadelphia a few days later. There was little the Americans could do about the captives, aside from ending the war. But they could do something about the ship. Retaking it was impossible. But on February 16, 1804, a small band of men, led by Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, boarded the ship in the middle of the night, set explosives, and then set the ship ablaze. If the Americans couldn't have the Philadelphia, then the Tripolitans couldn't either.
The capture and subsequent burning of the USS Philadelphia was certainly one of the most exciting episodes of the war. It inspired 6 cards for the shores of Tripoli. First, of course, is the Philadelphia runs aground, a chance for the Tripolitan player to either sink or, even better, capture an American frigate. The battle card Uncharted Waters pairs nicely, allowing the Tripolitan player to roll 2 dice instead of 1 and selecting the preferred result. The captain of the USS Philadelphia was William Bainbridge. He and his crew were taken captive and held in Tripoli. However, while imprisoned, Captain Bainbridge would sneak intel about Tripoli out through diplomatic channels. Hence, the Bainbridge Supplies Intel card. Bainbridge would later captain the USS Constitution during the War of 1812. Of course, Burn the Philadelphia was a must-have card, as Great Britain's Admiral Nelson was said to have called the feat the most bold and daring act of the age. The Americans, led by the daring Stephen Decatur, snuck into the harbor of Tripoli on the USS Intrepid, the previously captured Tripolitan ketch Mastico, and set the Philadelphia afire. Later that year, the Americans attempted to use the USS Intrepid as a floating volcano to be launched into the enemy fleet in the harbor of Tripoli. Commanded by Lieutenant Richard Somers, the Intrepid unfortunately exploded prematurely with a loss of Somers and all 12 of his men.
While the Navy was blockading the port of Tripoli, other Americans were strategizing a different way to win the war. William Eaton, U.S. Consul in Tunis, and James Leander Cathcart, former consul in Tripoli, hatched up a plan to stage a coup in Tripoli and put in a new ruler who was more favorable to American interests. The person they selected was Hamid Karamanli, the older brother of Yusuf Karamanli, the current Bashaw of Tripoli. Hamid had been overthrown by Yusuf, but now Eaton wanted to put him back on the throne. This plan took the better part of 4 years to materialize. After a lot of planning, complications, and confusion, Eaton went to Egypt in late 1804. He collected Hamid from where he was living in exile and began to assemble an army to fight against Yusuf. Finally, in March 1805, Eaton had assembled a troop of about 400 men, including local chieftains, Greek mercenaries, French cannoneers, and, of course, a handful of U.S. Marines. It took this company nearly 2 months to trek across the North African desert to the city of Derna. They attacked Derna on April 27, 1805, and they were able to take the city within just a few hours. This march across the shores of Tripoli would become immortalized in the U.S. Marine hymn.
There are 4 cards that recreate this march through the North African desert from Alexandria to Derna. Hamet's army creates this odd fighting force, and Hamet recruits Bedouins can complement it. General Eaton attacks Derna, reflects the march and attack on Derna, while Lieutenant O'Bannon leads the charge, honors the brave Marines who fought at Derna. While Tripoli agreed to peace shortly after the capture of Derna, there are 4 cards that allow the American player to explore the attempt to capture Tripoli and install Hamet on the throne. General Eaton attacks Benghazi, and Assault on Tripoli provide the last 2 pieces of the trek to Tripoli. Machine sharpshooters and send in the Marines beef up Hamet's army for the final assault. Of course, the Tripolitan player also has some fierce battle cards as well. Mercenaries' Desert can cause part of Hamet's army to melt away, and the guns of Tripoli threaten any naval invasion fleet. Join us next week as we'll continue with more tips from the shores of Tripoli.
With Eaton marching from the east and the Navy bombarding from the sea, Yusuf Karamanli began to think seriously about peace. The United States and Tripoli officially signed a peace treaty on June 10, 1805. That treaty stipulated that the United States would no longer pay any annual gifts to Tripoli, and it freed the prisoners from the USS Philadelphia for a one-time payment of $60,000. In exchange, the United States would free the Tripolitan prisoners that it held in Malta. Yusuf also demanded that Hamet and Eaton had to leave Derna. All of these terms were signed and agreed to, though William Eaton was furious when he learned that the United States government was not going to support Hamet or his claim. Though this was the end of war with Tripoli, it was not the end of payment to the Barbary states. The United States continued to make annual payments to the other 3 Barbary states until 1815, when the United States Navy came back in force to Algiers and fought in the Second Barbary War.
While historically the United States won the First Barbary War via peace treaty, the game allows for a greater variety of outcomes. Providing it's the fall of 1805 or later, the US player can win in 2 ways. After neutralizing Tripoli's allies, capturing the city of Dern, and clearing Tripoli of enemy frigates, the US player can play the Treaty of Peace and Amity to win the game immediately. Alternatively, the US player can achieve a more violent and forceful victory with a successful direct assault on Tripoli. The Assault on Tripoli card triggers this attack. The Tripolitan player has 3 paths to victory. If the Tripolitan player acquires 12 gold pieces, Tripoli wins immediately. Numerous cards can assist with this effort. Declaring war and raiding with Morocco, Algiers, and Tunis increases Tripoli's raiding capacity and creates multiple problems for the US player to handle. With these allies in play, the Yusuf Karamanli card increases in power, as a massive pirate raid from Tripoli and its allied nations can be a game-changing tactic. Lastly, Happy Hunting bolsters any Tripolitan raid with 3 additional dice. The Tripolitan player can also win by sinking 4 US frigates. This can happen through general gameplay, but Storms and the Philadelphia Runs Aground are 2 cards that Tripoli can play to sink or capture a US frigate outright. Lastly, if Tripoli eliminates Hamet's army, Tripoli wins the game instantly. If neither player achieves victory by the end of 1806, the game ends in a draw. In these episodes, we've covered many of the cards in the game, but there are more cards and strategies to discover as you play and learn the shores of Tripoli.